So we are ready to get started. Let me shut down the chat. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar about our latest research around software engineering benchmarks. I'm very excited today to have a couple of distinguished guests. So, introducing Tara Hernandez, VP of Developer Productivity at MongoDB. Hey, Tara.
Good morning.
Great to have you here.
You called us a distinguished guest. I'm not sure if I should be insulted or not.
Your call. And we also have Rob Zuber, CDO of Circle CI. Hey, Rob.
Good morning. Excited to be here. Well, good afternoon, good evening. I guess with that list of locations, could be
It's 5
anything.
o'clock somewhere.
Yeah,
Yeah, I saw Pune, India, so it is definitely evening time
yeah,
for them.
all of the above.
Yes.
Excited to be here.
Yeah, great. And I'm Yishai. I'm the CTO at Linear-B, and I will be hosting today's conversation. Trying to pull some threads with Rob and Tara to see get a conversation going. And the subject is engineering benchmarks or benchmarks for engineering metrics. We're gonna talk a little about the latest report we published. Everyone in the audience should have received the report already, and it will also be available on our website later. So we'll talk a little about what's new in the report, and then we'll double click into 5 key insights that are coming there. Let's see if we can cover them all or just, have a great conversation about some of them. So what has changed? Typically, we run these reports once or twice a year. We use the data we see from our customers and from our users on our free tier. What's changed this year is we have a much bigger population size. So this report was built using about a little over 6 million pull requests from 3,000 organizations across, more than 30 countries, so very varied. In this report, we are showing the metrics and the benchmarks for metrics across several methods of aggregation. The new one here is P90, so the 90th percentile. Most of the report is around the P75. We consider the 75th percentile to be the most useful. If you have to choose one, that's the useful aggregation method for most of the metrics because it lets you ignore the anomalies or the outliers. And we have 7 new metrics. So I'll talk about them very briefly, and then we can jump into insights. So the new metrics that we're showing benchmarks for this year are approve time and merge time. These are breakdowns of the measurement that we've had for a long time, which we call review time. Review time is the time spent between when the PR started to get a review, the first review activities, and all the way until merge. We are now breaking this down to how long did it take me to get the first approval, someone to approve my PR, and then from that time, how long did it take me to actually get the PR merged? And that split is useful because there are different dynamics in what affects these different times. Different people, maybe different processes to get things merged versus to get them approved. We have a new metric called PR maturity, which is around how ready is the PR to get merged when it was created. Did we have to change it a lot due to the code review, or was it almost there, maybe minor modification, and then it was merged? And finally, the 4 metrics at the bottom are all about understanding the level of adherence to, I would say, process and data. This is about, am I linking my branches to pull requests? Am I mentioning, my branches to tickets? Is there a link between the code work and the ticketing system? In the ticketing system, am I using hierarchy like epics, initiatives, and so on? Am I actually working on things that are within that hierarchy or standalone? And am I working with estimations like story points, with assignees, and so on? So these are the new metrics. Rob, Tara, any thoughts just, seeing these kind of metrics, things that jump out at you as very useful or not so useful, or any thoughts?
I'll go ahead. So, as we were talking earlier, I think the element of PR maturity is a really interesting one. And there's so many nuances there that I'm very curious to see as this gets measured over time, what sort of trends can come out, because you can imagine, especially if you think about tying it to one of the other indicators, like startups tend to have quicker, faster cycle times, whatever. And what I have seen is sure that is true, but there's also within a company, you can imagine you have, and MongoDB is a great example of this actually. We have small tools, we have SaaS tools, we have self-hosted tooling, and the cycle times that I have noticed around the different types of development targets, right? What's being produced also has an interesting impact that is notable and measurable. So it's definitely something really interesting. So bold move. Looking forward to seeing how it pans out.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's across all of these. I mean, we'll talk more when there's charts, and sort of spreads of data and stuff to look at. I think that's where the opinions will really come out. But I think in all of these cases, to Tara's point, putting it in the context of not just your organization, but the team, the particular type of work, can tell you a lot. And I think there's many places, and I'm going to say this over and over, where it's going to be hard to tell the difference between the highest and lowest performer. The middle will be different, but like kind of the difference between super high trust environments where, I mean, just the PR maturity, right? Like how long does that stay open? One of my favorite practices is put up a sketch and say, before I invest a lot of time and energy in this, what do y'all think? Right. And then it's going to sit open for a while and nobody's going to be doing anything with it. And that's totally fine. But that's very different from I have no idea what I'm doing and I'm trying to put up a PR and then it's going through all this rehashing. So like there's always going to be another level, always another layer that, that it's important to have the data, but then you need to go kind of figure out what's going on in that organization or that part of your team or whatever that is. So I'm excited to get into all these. I think they all will tell us something. Exactly. Interesting is going to be the right word, right? We're going to learn something.
Yeah. What's special to me about PR maturity is that it like most of the more interesting metrics, it's like more like a U shape. If your PR maturity is at 100%, all your PRs are pristine and they get merged exactly like they were created, something's wrong with the review process, right? It's not a good result. So
the only thing going into the repo is Dependabot requests, right? I mean,
yeah. But basically, like the best score, the highest score is not necessarily the best outcome. So a very low score is not the best. The very high score is not the best. The middle is interesting. Like you said, Rob, it's like, and this is also the best performing teams or the teams that are weaker. They're going to be a little harder to tell apart. But the middle part of the metric is where it's interesting. Do I have someone who's learning how to create PRs that are a little more ready to get merged and don't have to be rewritten completely all the time, right? That's the
right. I mean, I could name 300% scenarios that I would say are totally different, right? One is everybody pairs. So by the time it gets into a PR, the other person just approves it and you move on.
right?
Like it is actually a great PR because the work didn't happen like it all happened before the PR. The second is people are terrified to put a PR up until they know something is perfect and they spend way too long working on everything. And then by the time it goes up, it's good, but your process is like ridiculously slow, which probably wouldn't be the outcome in pairing, right? And then the third is nobody bothers looking at PRs and they just approve them all and your code base is ridiculous. Like, and each of those is going to be a completely different outcome from the other one, which is the point, right? Like it's super interesting to see that, but you have to see that and then say, okay, what does that mean about my organization, about the teams in my organization?
Are there other metrics that are going to help me decipher which is it, or do I need to just drill in and have a conversation? So let's jump in and start looking at our insights. A few insights coming from that report. The report is long, our time today is short. So we picked a few. I'm starting with the first one, which is around, understanding the pull request lifecycle and looking at the data. We see that the size of the pull request or, typical sizes of pull request will be one of the most significant drivers for moving fast with my PRs. Probably not a surprise. We all know that huge PRs are hard to review. People shy away from reviewing those, or they just rubber stamp it, right? That's the other way. Much riskier to get merged and deploy. And this chart also shows us that correlation between my PR size or my typical PR size in our organization and my typical pickup time. Pickup time is interesting. That's the measure from when the PR was created or published until the reviewer starts to work on it. So if I'm like naive, this should not be affected by the size, right? It's just queuing time. It's not actual review time. But still, there's a pretty strong correlation. My interpretation here is that people don't like to review long PRs. So they will maybe open it, but then move away. They're not going to actually begin reviewing. So it remains in the queue, if you like. I wonder what you've seen around the pull request size or batch size and how that affects the way the dev teams work.
I mean, for me, I think that, so first of all, let me just say that my favorite PR that I've ever made in the history of my life, if you're really curious, you can go back and see it in GitHub. It was like 3 years ago. I was working at Google and we were refactoring a huge chunk of code. The team that I was working with, they did all of the work, but then we realized, oh, the last bit of work is to retire the old code. And so I had a PR. Then the reason it was my favorite, it was almost 1 million lines of code and it was all deletes. Right?
That's like,
So and again, so I was thinking about maturity. It went pretty quickly because it was just deletes and there was like a couple of checks. Did I get the files right? Whatever. Right. But what an outlier, right? To completely throw off like
you
the
mean no one
standard.
actually reviewed the million like lines of code in that PR?
That there was actually a couple of comments. It was not 100% exact PR. It was like, oh, that file shouldn't be included. This file was, accidentally touched. And, in all other circumstances, of course, you would never, ever, ever land a PR like that, except in this case, it made sense because you're retiring code that in theory has been deprecated. So I think that to me, going back to what we were saying earlier, the size, yes, absolutely. Supremely large size PRs means you probably didn't break down the work. You haven't been working all along, with in either pair or ongoing review mechanism. And, the takeaway is probably that it's a coaching opportunity, to whoever produced that PR. And maybe in some team cases, I'm wondering, is the correct response to actually cancel that PR and say, go back, try again, break it up, as opposed to now someone is going to take a week to slug through this, 1,000 file change. So and I think the interesting thing to me is how do we tie this data to other types of data, other types of insights? So it feels like it's part of the best picture is this is part of a compound insight, if you will, right?
Yeah.
What's the historical trend that the team has had? What is the target the team has moving forward as far as velocity? And then how would this be used to measure basically as a waypoint? Where are we in our trajectory for our goals around developer velocity? To me, I don't know, Rob, what do you think?
I agree with a huge amount of that. One thing that I can't help but point out looking at this, and I think I looked at the full report last night, there's a different chart that really shows this, but like the R squared on this line has got to be really small, right? Like there's two giant clusters that are more flat across here, which I think in the report is called out as like kind of within the same day and then the next day sort of thing, which is a really interesting dynamic. I think, and there's the amazing amount of conversation in the chat, which I'm loving. First of all, asking for the units on the scale. So, I guess lesson for next time, but so hours in terms of pickup time and then lines, right? In terms of the PR side. So lines changed. But I think those two clusters are really interesting, and they say something about, maybe mentality of organizations. Like there's probably a different attribute of these dots that I would want to know, and I don't know what that is, right? But do those cluster on something else, right? Is there something that those two clusters are floating around? Is it specific orgs or specific repos where everyone just waits a while? They come in the morning and that's PR time versus we review PRs right away. Like in super high performing teams that I've been in, PR reviews were pretty much instant because everybody knew what everybody was working on. There wasn't a when am I going to carve out time to get up to speed and understand that thing. It was, oh yeah, I know exactly what you're doing, and let me take a quick look. Yep. Oh, I see that this thing isn't covered maybe by testing. Did you consider that case? Great. Like, I'm going to add something for that, and let's go. And then in I don't want to call them low performing, but in other teams that I've seen, like, people are more disconnected in what they work on, right? And this is like totally is going to get into like WIP limits and how you think about doing your work and that sort of thing. But if getting up to speed on what someone else is working on is a core part of getting a PR reviewed, it's always going to take longer. It's always going to get, regardless of if it's tiny or big, honestly, it's going to
Yeah.
take time to say, okay, I got to stop what I'm doing, context switch into what this person is doing, try to get myself up to speed, understand it, and move it. And so those, like, there's, again, I'm going to say this on every slide and metric probably, understanding what's happening in your organization is really important. But this is going to tell you, right? If you look at these numbers and say, wait a second, I saw a slide that says people review their stuff in under an hour every time, and we always take a day or 2 days or 3 days, right? What's happening in our organization? How could we change our work structure? And I think there's a, I might be jumping ahead on slides, but a conclusion like, therefore, we must commit to making smaller PRs. But the question is it the small PR that's driving the long review time? Or is it the long review time that's driving the big PR, right? If I know no one's going to touch my PR for 3 days, I might as well get everything into it, right? And I think those are feedback loops.
Vicious cycles. Yeah.
Yeah, if your organization is slow, then you're going to put more into the PR. If I got to wait 3 days, I'm just going to keep adding to it, right? You'll see PRs that got opened and more stuff got added versus I got to review this one's in and then I got to learn techniques to make small PRs, right?
So
And
this
that's
is
the
a
exact-
whole
other
other
thing.
comment about coaching. And yeah, I
Right.
mean,
And
tearing
that's an
apart-
exact analog to like patch release cycles. Like, if continuous deployability means that you release, small and frequently, right? And if you release infrequently, everybody tries to get their stuff in, right? And then all of a sudden your patch sizes blow up and your
then
churn
it's
rate goes up.
harder to deploy or release
Yeah,
quickly.
exactly.
Yeah, and Rob, I loved your comment about it just, it's both familiarity with the content or can I actually be effective in reviewing this, but it's, also about, do I even know that something's waiting for me? Is the communication working? Maybe, I've seen teams where people don't know. And then people have to chase others to actually take a look because, oh, there's a PR waiting for me. I didn't notice. So there's so much to it, and you have to use the signal to basically dive in.
I wonder if there's going back to what, earlier, we were talking about like, smaller companies, larger companies, that kind of thing. I wonder if there's also an inflection point, right? There's a certain, with a smaller engineering team, I think, anecdotally, I think people call it out as like, the ideal team for many people is like 100 engineers or less, right? That there's a lot of people who like that size because everybody knows roughly what everybody is doing. And there's a lot of tribal knowledge that correctly or incorrectly, however you want to describe it, facilitates maybe a false velocity that doesn't scale.
Yep.
Right. And so there's that evolution, going back to like, am I waiting on a PR? Right. Have you started using code owners yet or some other similar thing and being intentional about the structure of not just the code in the repo, but the people around the repo or across the organization that helps facilitate awareness, visibility, right? And that has to be, that doesn't just happen. That's somebody taking a lot of time and curation, right? So
I
it's
love that.
really interesting.
Developer teams and orgs tend to focus on the code and focusing on understanding the process. Like, who is even doing reviews here? I've seen teams where there's a single person. That's the by definition, they've defined a bottleneck. They only trust this person to review code. Well, awareness to the process, awareness to how is it actually happening here and what are the reasons for getting delays? Yeah, without that, you're not going to be able to scale beyond whatever happens in a room or maybe, a floor. So the report has a little more data and nice charts about additional ways to look at PR size and how that affects not just the pickup, that was the first one, but also longer cycles, end to end, time to get approval, time to, if it's already waited for a while, it's also going to take longer to merge. Everything gets slower with larger PRs. And the final item here, and that's an interesting graph on the bottom right, the larger PRs will also tend to be more heavily modified. And this is, to me, it's not a trivial insight here, because if I have a 2-line PR, very, very tiny PR, and 1 line gets changed, the PR maturity is going to be half. So even taking into account that ratio, larger PRs tend to get modified. They're less ready to get merged. I think that also comes to the fact that a large PR will tend to have the code base run away from, like in many cases, my merge target is moving. Everything is slower. My merge target is also moving. I have to basically refactor my PR multiple times just to get it ready to get merged, because the code has shifted while I was working on it. And while the review process was going on. So we talked about large PRs, and either it's clear that they are, things you want to make, move for short PR and small PRs, or at least see what else is happening in the dynamic. Let me move into our second insight. So this is an area that we've talked a bit earlier this week, and I know this is going to create some nice conversation. We are talking about project management hygiene, and this is the set of metrics that talk about, am I linking my code and my PRs to my ticketing system? Am I using structure in my tickets? Am I assigning work to people in my tickets? All of that, tasks that developers typically don't love, about making sure that the ticketing system, my Jira, my Azure boards, actually tracks what I'm doing. And what we see in the data is that if you have lower or poorer hygiene in that area, this actually correlated with higher velocity. So, there's no rules, you move fast. To me, the interesting bar, like the rightmost bar, the area where the hygiene is very low, that's the area where you have much better coding time and other metrics. There's a jump. Everything is faster when you don't have to worry about the process. But my question is, okay, but where do we pay the price?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm excited about this metric. My theory, and first of all, before I say this, I want to thank you all for putting all this data together. Like Tara and I only saw this data just for everyone, like last night, basically the actual full report.
We want to get your immediate response.
Yeah, exactly. And I had so many thoughts about this, and I think what's really interesting about this particular metric, and what I would want to understand more about, whether it was my organization or if y'all can find something about this, like I think Tara raised the point of, like, what do we see later, right? We can project that maybe later that code base slows down, right? When we have low quality that allows us to go fast, we know we pay the price down the road because things get more complex. We don't know how to make changes. Changes are unsafe, all of those things. On the other hand, again, my theory on this particular point is it would be difficult to discern the difference between the highest performing and the lowest performing teams on this metric. The mid will look great, right? Like if you have a lot of hygiene, meaning every single piece of work is tied to a ticket, and that ticket's part of an epic, and that epic's part of some, initiative. Honestly, I doubt people are just cleaning up code when they see bad code, because it's a high expense to do basic things that are important to the code base and in a super high trust, high performing team, you tend to look at the person sitting next to you, who's the PM or whatever, and say, hey, I think maybe we should clean up this thing right here. You think we should do that? Yeah, okay, let's do that. And maybe that happens without a ticket, and that's totally fine because everyone knows that everyone is aligned around the mission. So that's the super high performing. At the super low performing end is just chaos, right? Like, we don't care about anything. We're not actually driving towards the goals of the organization. And those two, I think on this metric, would look identical. In the middle, you have the safety net of, like, no one does any work without talking to someone else and making sure that work's been cleared by the tower and whatever. Like, I think we've painted that as the picture of ideal, but I still think that's the picture of, like, this is how we manage these things at scale because we don't know how to be, super effective and super high trust. Does that make sense?
And to me, it comes back to the same thing we were talking about on PR size, right? Which is all by itself, I don't think it, to fully 100% agree with Rob, it does not provide a comprehensive insight. It has to be within the context of a broader set of, what are the outcomes that we're going for? What are the quality bars that we're trying to achieve? I think we can all agree that, I can check in little PRs all day long and completely screw my team by checking in, crappy garbage, right? And the need. So here's my biggest overall worry when you look at a set of insights, right? Which is their misuse, right? And every time something comes out, even we can state a DevOps report, this report, there was another one that came out, and it's like you look at a particular thing in isolation, like, oh yeah, that seems reasonable, but then you try and apply it, and it's like, okay, but what about? And then there's, boom, right? There's this long list of conditionals that could influence in either direction. Oh, that makes it a more useful metric, or that makes it a less useful metric. And so, and I think on the lead up, Yishai, we were talking. I'm like, the worst thing we can do is have too much process, right? I think that I am almost willing to say that should be a universal truth, right? Too much process will always slow things down, except for when, imagine we're talking about software at a nuclear energy plant, right? I can always think of an exception to every rule.
Where's my ticket?
Yeah. I need a ticket and I need 1,000 reviewers, and 500 of them need to have PhDs from this university, right? To make sure that we don't blow something up. So maybe that's excessive. I don't know. If I live close to the nuclear power plant, I might not think so.
To me, this all goes back to intent. You talked about misuse, and I think any metric, any number can be misused.
Yes.
Especially if the intent is for, I don't know, management is looking for metrics to use as whips, or to say this team is bad. Even perfect metrics will eventually, they could be misused or abused. And then if your intent is, okay, I want to understand where there's value, where there's improvement to be made, you can still make mistakes. But then part of your journey with the numbers in the benchmarks is to understand, okay, there's a set of questions I should be asking. And maybe I discover that in my case, the level of, I don't know, process in this case, in this set of metrics, works for me, right? I mean, Rob, you talked about high trust environments where everyone knows what they're doing and they're also aligned to what the business needs. So they will spend that uncharted time working on or refactoring code in exactly the places where the business needs that. Eventually, and that comes with some scale, someone will have to understand what's the level of investment we are, like how much are we spending on refactors? And even just understanding that is hard if it's not like, if there's no ticket or some tracking of that work to let me know, okay, we've actually spent 20% of our time in refactoring, which is what we needed. So
yeah, I think it's worth clarifying. I'm looking at like the chat a little bit at the same time. Like, I am old enough that refactoring to me is not a negative, right? Like, somehow that word has been, I don't know it's been stolen to mean
Okay.
like, we're going to rewrite this entire thing in a different language. That's not refactoring. Refactoring is like, I guess Kent Beck now calls it tidying, just to get rid of the refactoring word. Like, I'm in this code and it's difficult to do the thing I'm trying to do. So I also make the effort to make it easier, or I've developed a little bit of a novel understanding that wasn't clear. So I make it clearer while I'm working here. And what I see when we get to these levels of high process, what's called hygiene here, is people saying, well, I can't touch that because that wasn't documented in the ticket that I'm working on. Therefore, I need to create a separate ticket to do something that's plain as day while it's right in front of me.
Yep.
And now I'm going to wait till the next sprint planning to discuss changing the name of this thing or whatever it was that I was going to do. And by then it's not plain as day. I don't even remember why I wanted to do it. And so I don't do it. Right.
I don't want to do it anymore.
And so the natural sort of growth or evolution of the code base is to one that is actually more difficult to work on, more difficult to understand, because we're so hung up on everything being perfectly documented. Again, I'm not talking about we're going to rewrite this service in Rust because I learned about Rust over the weekend and that's really fun. That's not refactoring, right? But we've stolen that word or abused the word or whatever you want to call it. So let's call it tidying, but just like the general practices of I am here making a change and we didn't know about this change before, right? That's okay. That's software evolves. But if we don't allow it to shift its shape so that it's more supportive of the things we learn as we learn them, then we actually end up degrading the quality of it over time.
Yeah.
And that to me is a practice that, like, as you start to say, nope, we must absolutely like identify this work and call it out and have a separate, I mean, maybe you could do structural, do PR, separate PRs for structure,
Maybe
whatever.
there's a balance, or like I've seen places where the flow was, yeah, do what you need, do what makes sense right now, and there's some automation magic that will, either create a ticket or bind this to a general tidying up ticket. But we can help you create that documentation in the right place for the product managers and for the overall reporting to work with minimal intervention or even a context switch. If we can make that happen for you, you can do what you need. There is a pull request, right? The data is there. It's not like you've done this in the dark, but
So,
creating
to-
or reflecting that back to whatever ticketing system or whatnot, and saying, we actually in the sprint, we also did this and this and this. Great, done. I didn't have to go and create a ticket for it or go through paperwork. Maybe
I
that's the
mean,
right.
to me, this is a great example of why some genius invented, what do you call them? ADRs, architectural decision records, right? Now, architectural makes it sound maybe more fancy than it actually has to be. But, I would actually push on, does anything need to be a ticket at all, right? In certain contexts, right? It's like you talked about, oh, maybe go make a ticket after the fact or something. Like, no, it doesn't need to be a ticket. It's not a project that needs to be tracked. It is a piece of engineering work that we want to document. And the model should be you document it at the time you make the code. So to Rob's point, you don't forget that thing that I did. You now have a decision record. If that's a framework that you like, there are other ways of doing it. But that's you could call it a coding standard or a cultural artifact where you just say whatever it is that you do, make sure that you have commented your code or put your ADR or whatever it is for your breadcrumbs, so that 6 months from now you don't think, what the hell was I thinking, or what the hell was somebody else thinking. That's still my favorite bash.org. If you remember bash.org, it's like I was looking at my code I wrote 6 months ago. I was like, what was I thinking? So I think, and again, this is where, process could get in the way. If the process is anything that you touch has to have a ticket, I think we're getting in the way of engineers having the ability and discretion to do the correct thing at the right time. And I would argue, I would actually call refactoring, or however you want to describe it. I think tidying is silly. I don't like that. I like refactoring. It's like we have a 10-year-old code base.
We're paying up a lot of
We've
technical debt.
changed compilers, right? There's just fundamental things that are now no longer optimized, right? There's now something that we've clearly identified as something that we want to be a shareable module. We gotta change the way that we interface with it and have a better public API so that we can isolate it and have contract boundaries, right? Like, I think that there's this element of and the other part of this, right, going back to PR size and whatever, right, you have ideally a team structure that is in a, I don't want to say constant state of evolution. Sorry about that. But like you've got people who are becoming seniors and staff engineers and people that are new college grads that are coming in, and what great tasks for them to go and like, okay, hey, go fix this thing that's been like increasingly becoming vexing, right? And learn the code base, right? And then that person's probably going to first come back with some ginormous PR where they redid the entire refactor as one thing, right? And goes back to context, right? And I think that PR being huge and having a million comments and basically having what would that be on the maturity scale is actually, here is evidence of your learning, right? What a growth,
Yeah.
this is your growth. But
I'm sure
yeah,
there's Yeah, I'm sure
Sorry, go ahead.
there's going to be a million opinions on this and more in the chat. I want to push on, but yeah, this is an exciting area that, just to begin understanding what the data looks like and what different organizations feel around process, too much, too little, in between. Definitely something we will learn from. So I will push on through and look at our third insight. This is when we look at cycle time, one of the key DORA metrics, lead time for change, and so on. When you have higher cycle times, longer cycles, they will these organizations will also tend to have a higher rate of failures in production. Always the difficulty in understanding, or how do we exactly measure this? But overall, you see when we benchmark, the slower you are on cycle time, every change has to go through more. There are going to be more production failures. I like the analogy, and this is, we've been hearing this a lot over the years, a little less recently. If we deploy faster, if we make changes fast, will that not break our production? Is that not more risky than treading slowly? And I like to think about this as riding a bike, where you actually fall over if you're too slow. Being able to change things fast and doing that all the time actually gets your production, your uptime, to a better place. What are you seeing?
Shockingly, I don't take issue with with this finding. Well, we didn't really have intros, but this is what I do all day long. I would say, I first started doing continuous deployment in 2011 at a different startup where we were just trying to launch a business and whatever. And my business partner said, "Hey, we should consider this." And I had that attitude that you just described. I came from enterprise software, year-long releases, and I was like, releasing is terrifying. Why would we want to do that more often, right? But I think we've learned, 14 years later, I certainly learned pretty quickly because we were low risk. We were, there's a lot of discussion about size of org and whatever. We're like, well, we don't have any customers yet. This seems like a good time to try this if anyone was going to try it.
The best time.
And I've never looked back. I would not wish anything other than continuous deployment on anybody, because okay, we can go back to your nuclear power plant, but like the small batch size is the key, right? If I'm moving quickly, if I'm deploying frequently, like you can't have rapid deploys without short cycle time. We know that, right? So because it does exactly what we talked about before. If it takes longer to deploy, I'll put more stuff in there. And as soon as I put more stuff in there, I've increased the risk, right? And for anyone who's shipped something into production, and broken something, right? If it was a 2-line PR, 5-line PR, whatever we're talking about, it's not hard to find the problem, right? So not only are you less likely to have because to get the mechanics in place to move that quickly, you basically have all the pieces to prevent production failures, but you're also reducing the risk if there's a production failure, right? And then you continue on with that tooling you put in place. There was a mention of feature flags somewhere in the chat here, things like progressive delivery, where I put this in front of a small percentage of my customers. Like, we've learned how to do that really effectively, such that even when there's an issue in production, it's constrained. We can pull it back out nearly instantly, or we can just shut off the traffic that's going to it. All of those things. And once you have that comfort, then again, to the correlation versus causation, when I have the comfort that I'm not going to cause a production incident, my cycle time will increase. My rate of delivery will increase, right? Because now I feel super confident that I can deliver, and I'm not sitting there staring at it, getting 5 other people to review my PR, because I know we have the safety nets in place to allow me to move more quickly, right? So again, I'm actually not totally sure this is a causation, right? Or which way it goes. I think it's positive feedback loops again. If you can move really quickly, if you have the confidence that you're not going to cause a production incident, you will move faster, and then you will move faster, and you'll be at the top end of this that is showing we move really quickly, but we don't have production failures.
So 3 or 4 companies ago, I lose track. We had 2 distinct engineering teams. There was ostensibly a back-end team and a front-end team. And the back-end team was working with very closely, and we wanted to do continuous deployment. So this is the team that oversaw account management and payment systems and a very constrained set of functions, and we wanted to be able to do continuous deployability because we knew that if there was a problem, we wanted to be able to go fast to fix it, right? So there's like a really good incentive there. And when we started, we failed almost every deploy. And I'm going back, and the team is really frustrated. I'm looking like, okay, what's your test strategy? What are all the cultural elements that you have in place? And we realized that there just was not, going fast implies that you also, to your point, Rob, have the confidence. Well, you have to build that confidence explicitly. Like, what are your tests? What are your reviews? All that stuff. And so we went from weekly. So it went from quarterly to monthly to weekly to daily to multiple daily. And when it started and it was failing almost every time we pushed it, there was like 60 tests covering the whole system. And by the time we were, and that was at weekly, they were getting by with 60. To get to daily, we ended up having 2,500 tests at different schedule times, put all of this engineering effort. And we were literally deploying every third commit. And I think after I left, they probably got to pretty close to every commit reliably. Now, here's the funny thing. The other engineering team was still all about the quarterly, right? And because they were relying on those services in the early days in their heads, they kept thinking, oh, this continuous deployability is a farce. And even when we were we are deploying reliably, every time there's a problem, it must be the back end because they changed something. Right. And so that was one of those like catch-22 sorts of situations. And then we had to instrument a whole bunch of telemetry and build these dashboards to show actually, no, here I'm proving to you, stubborn VP, that these changes are actually in your system and not here. We've deployed 64 times and you haven't noticed once. Right. And so it was almost like we gave ourselves added friction initially. And there was, I don't know all the lessons that could have been learned there. I doubt I learned them all. But it was a really fascinating reminder that at the end of the day, all of this stuff, these metrics, everything, the people factor is going to be the most interesting and the hardest challenge, right?
It's all about people.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, Rob, you have some technology in this space, but it's all about people, right?
Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
All technology problems are people problems.
Amen to that.
Amen.
Yeah. It's culture, right? It's absolutely culture. And you mentioned, trying to lobby your VP, like it's on execs, it's on leaders, right? To support the change. Like we love to have these grassroots movements, but if they're not supported, they get stamped out. And hopefully, I mean, I'm hopeful. I happen to we're a CI/CD company. I'm a big believer. I'm an executive at the company. My CEO is a big believer. Like he was the one that convinced me to do it back in 2011. We don't have a problem with this. But I know that doesn't exist. Like there's some comments like I can't, I can't imagine a world without it. Like the thing I have to remind myself all the time is what a bubble I live in. My customers are people who believe in this. My company is a company that believes in this. I live in the Bay Area where people are very comfortable pushing the limits, understanding what's possible. They're always trying to be better. And there are organizations where that's still scary, right? And we meet those organizations absolutely in our work, and it takes time and it takes energy to help them see, et cetera, et cetera. But I think we're when I think about many of these processes, we're at least past the early adopters and into the majority in terms of, people recognizing that this differentiates their business, right? It is business results. Like I think one of the things that the group behind Dora, or maybe it is Dora that is the group behind Dora. Anyway, they keep moving around. But anyway, one of the key results of that was the correlation to business outcomes, right?
Yes.
To really say like, we don't necessarily know that you're shipping value every day, but we know this is, I would say, necessary, not sufficient. If you can't deliver effectively, you will not be the most successful business. Just because you can deliver effectively doesn't mean you're building the right things and all these other, solving real customer problems. But if you're not effectively delivering, you're hopeless. So
you don't have a feedback loop
there.
that's going to teach.
Right.
If you're not able to deliver frequently, there's no feedback loop for you to
adapt, and you're burning cycles
perfectly what customers need from now and forever. No, you need a feedback loop, and the more tight it is, that's your advantage.
Mm-hmm.
In the interest of time, let me
we could be here all day.
We really could.
I love this.
So looking at this chart looks at the PR maturity, reminder, this is how close was the PR when published, when we asked for the review, to the actual PR at the end when it was merged. Higher PR maturity means less was changed. And then on the so here we are looking at both the PR maturity compared to merge rate, like how frequently are we merging per developer. And in general, the better the PR maturity, the higher velocity we have. My take here, and this goes back to this being not more like a U-shaped metric, but if the review cycle is a little more expensive than coding. Like if I'm working on a pull request, I'm working on something, I don't have to context switch for that. I'm already spending a lot of my time there. Getting a review to help me means someone else is context switching. Someone else has to come into my world and provide their inputs. If I can front load of like some of that effort, put a little more effort there to save the reviewer time or to help them understand what they're seeing, that carries a lot of benefit. If I overdo it, like Rob, you said, I work on this, I polish this for years until it's ready, that's obviously overdoing it. But in general, investing another half hour on my side is better than having the reviewer spend another half hour. So that's why I interpret this as if your PRs are a little better, a little readier to get merged, that will help everyone move fast. I'm wondering what your insights here or your thoughts.
I'm super fascinated by this. I don't know that I have any real like the correlation to velocity, where I think by velocity you're talking about, is it PR
Well,
throughput?
in this case,
Effectively,
this is like, yeah, merge rate. So how
Yeah.
quickly are we merging? But it's going to
Well-
be around merge frequency, shorter pickups. There's a bunch of metrics that will be better if my PRs are generally more ready.
I find that really interesting because I think the thing that gets you success is like a shared understanding of what you're trying to achieve. And I think that discussing earlier your approach gets you to better outcomes. Those are beliefs that I have. So
Yep.
Sometimes I said this earlier, like in some cases I'll just it depends on the team. If everyone's sitting right next to me, which is not super common these days, then I'll just turn to someone and say, hey, I'm thinking about doing this. Like, what do you think? And I won't put up a PR. But if we're more distributed, I might, or like different time zones or whatever, I might put a sketch up in a PR and work on it publicly.
Yeah.
Right.
Typically called these draft PR. So we typically look at when what the PR was actually like, okay, please review this, it's ready.
Well,
that's then when we measure maturity.
I've been using GitHub PRs since they were launched, so I'll say like draft PR is kind of a pretty new feature, right? But regardless, like that sort of notion of let's just work on it publicly, and I guess now you can take that data out, assuming people use that feature. Like it's just a flag. It doesn't really change.
A lot of people just put it do not merge in the
comment, exactly,
right?
exactly.
Same like we were able to like distinguish that too. So
okay, well that's really interesting.
At least the intention here, and hopefully the data is clean enough, it's not perfect, is that PR maturity starts when you've actually said this is ready, please review it. Please get it, like review and approve it.
And I think there's a school of thought too, right? Like I personally am with Rob. Like I think there should be a shared context that in the majority case where there is an understanding prior to the review that the reviewer is not coming in completely cold, right? That facilitates, a faster thing. There is another school of thought that I think is also legitimate. It's just a different school of thought, which is the reviewer should always come in cold because they're going to be
untainted.
They're not tainted. There's not too much shared understanding. There's less likely for assumptions in theory, et cetera. I mean, that's the theory. But it adds, at best, it adds cycle time it adds to the cycle time because of the onboarding, right?
Yep.
And Google has this concept of readability, and certain types of PRs would require someone who had readability in either like a particular programming language, maybe because, you know, you're touching some very low level header file in the C++ code, so you better get a C++ readability review, or you're required, or API readability because it's a public API and we don't want to break the gRPC protobufs, blah, 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 right?
Yep.
So, but I think that in the aggregate, for overall velocity, the emphasis on making sure you're not siloing domain knowledge in the long run is
Mhm.
super critical,
Mhm.
right? And PRs can be a really good way, but should not be the only way, in my view, for that to happen, for there to be that cross training. You know, you don't want the same person always working in the same module, I don't think, because then you have bus factor, right? Or we've been trying to get away from violence, but lottery factor, right? So, but I think, yeah, it's I think that the healthiest teams, I would suspect, and I think Rob does too, are going to be the ones where, you know, at MongoDB, we often write a technical review document that, especially if it's something kind of complex, so people can start to like read into, what are you thinking? Is this going to actually solve the problem? And then that pool of reviewers for that thinking then automatically just roll into people who can then review, you know, the PR. They may not have been following along the coding all that time, but they know really well what that code is supposed to do, right? And so
Right.
there's that all important context.
Well, tying two things together, I like that. I mean, obviously, all this like work comes in different sizes. Yes, we should be able to chop things down into smaller pieces, but sometimes we're doing small pieces of a big thing. Sometimes we're just doing something really small. So if you're talking about a sort of technical definition, this is our plan, a design, whatever, people are read into it. I would hope they're also seeing PRs along the way, right?
Yeah.
Not okay, and then here we we implemented this, and here's your
Here's the
50,000
1,500
line
file
PR.
change.
Yeah, exactly. Like, but
Well,
I've been
PR,
keeping
yeah.
up, right? Like maybe we're rotating in depending on who's around, but we're, you know, there's a few people who are up to speed, maybe more than one. If it's a big thing, it's probably more than one person contributing, right? Like this thing where we
Right.
all are in a team, but we all get in our own lanes and work on totally different things. Like I think we've concluded that's not the best strategy. And so there is always some opportunity for someone to be a little more read in and share that context. And yes, I think I love the readability point. I think there's actually a couple former Googlers who wrote a book writing
Probably.
readable something about readable
like
code.
that,
Now I
yeah.
forget the title of it, but the art of readable code, maybe. I thought it was great. But yes, that check of like, I'm coming in cold. Do I even understand what's happening here? Like that feels like it would be a problem if it were not true. On the other hand, I guess there's one big unknown in here, and it's different in different organizations. What are you expecting people to look for and find in a PR review, right? Like, are you looking for bugs? Are you trying to digest every line of logic and actually spot flawed thinking? Or are you looking to ensure that there's a test that demonstrates that the logic is good, in which case you as a human probably shouldn't have to parse every line and understand whether it's working or not, right? Are you looking for coding style, or do you have linters that already enforce that somewhere that you don't have to look for that in a PR? Like, I think that's a thing we've talked a lot about, culture that needs to be really well established in
Absolutely.
order for PRs to be effective.
Yeah. I mean, I worked at a place where the code review process required the reviewer actually themselves compile and run the code locally, right? I don't see that actually happen very often these days. In fact, I can't remember the last time I saw that happen.
Now, that's
Um,
pretty extreme to actually run it and test it, but
Yeah. Well, I take that back. The Google team that did container tools, you know, Conoco, Minikube, they did that. But that was really small, right? Those were the small little isolated CLI tools, so it was much easier to do. You know, I don't think that you know, if you have some like ginormous enterprise SaaS, unless you have an unbelievable staging environment, which you might, that could be challenging. And so but then in most cases, you're going to be relying, I think, more on the CI system
yeah,
to
some
be grabbing
automation.
that PR and executing tests, right? I think that's where the industry has gone, and it's more efficient, assuming you have a level of confidence. So maybe back to your point, Rob, is really part of that PR is the test changes, or the test changes that are part of this, you know, executed correctly, implemented correctly, and running would actually be probably the equivalent of that.
Yeah, I've
Right.
seen places where the reviewer actually looks at the tests and the results of the run, Another interesting case is when the reviewers are not just coders. Sometimes you want to review the PR for, does it do what it's designed to do? The feature, so you have product managers and owners looking at they eventually have to say the new code is doing what I needed. So I've seen places where the PR is actually, okay, run this in somewhere for me, or I can run it somewhere and look at the UI or look at the behavior. Almost either like full-blown QA. I've seen teams where the manual QA phase has happened before merge, or just, this does what I intended. I wanted a green triangle and it's not a blue square.
It's probably hard for you to see here, but I'd be fascinated to see where the teams with manual QA land on all of these metrics. I don't think that helps your cycle and merge time. Yeah,
I agree. That's definitely
I think that's a whole, like, I have so many strong feelings about this.
with
I think that's a whole
60
nother
seconds
group.
remaining, we'll just drop into that topic.
Yeah, maybe we should do a follow-up on manual QA and try to single out those in some report. Yeah, I'm gonna skip the predictability part, just in the just to keep us within some time limit. So just for closing remarks, question to you, Rob. Looking at engineer metrics, looking at benchmarks, and in general things we've discussed today, one or two takeaways, things that you want to take away, or we should keep top of mind when thinking about engineering metrics and benchmarks and the good stuff we've discussed today.
Yeah, I think the headline for me is always that metrics and data are a great way to start a conversation. So I'm super thankful for this conversation. It's about your organization, what you're trying to do, what kind of product you're building. Like, we've kind of run over the gamut there. But ultimately, it will probably tell you something, but it's not going to tell you the answer. It's going to tell you where to go look, right? If you look at some of these things and look at benchmarks and you say, okay, we're different from the benchmark, but I asked about R squared and clusters and stuff like that. Like, what's happening in those organizations? And ultimately, that's not even that important. The question is what's happening in your organization and where is your opportunity to deliver more customer value, more business value, more effectively, which is likely going to mean faster, but also safely. This is just like knowing this about your organization is super helpful, but it's just the beginning of asking some questions and really diving in and ultimately talking to humans because it's about people.
Thanks. Tara, what about you?
I could not agree more with what Rob said, and I think I'll pile on, which is, I think the organizations that care about developer velocity, along with customer experience, quality, and all those things, are going to recognize the investment and the cost that it takes to do this well, right? Whether you do this because you've made it part of the role of the engineering leaders, right? Your managers and directors and whatnot, or you've invested in, technical project management, program management type of roles, whatever it is, you don't get this for free, right? It is an investment, but I think it is, I would argue, and I will die on this hill very consistently, that obviously as a VP of developer productivity, that, the best organizations will recognize the value of this and understand how it's a multiplier, to your ability to meet your business goals. So
Yeah.
again, going back to, it's a people thing at all levels, right? At all
Totally
levels.
agree. And I love thinking about metrics, or basically any kind of measurement or insight that you're learning about how your people work, and that's the beginning of a conversation, of a process, of a way to get better. It's not, the answer is not 7 or 42. It's going to be, okay, there's
Well, it is
something here
42.
I need to.
You just don't know the question.
It's 42. Yeah. Okay. We can always rephrase the question. So thank you, Rob, Tara. This was great. Thank you for joining and giving us all your thoughts and ideas.
Thank you for your data. I think
Thinking about doing this again. This is great. Everyone here on the chat and listening in, thank you for your time. Grab our latest engineering benchmarks report from our website, or just grab a demo of our developer productivity platform. Some links here on the page. Thank you, everyone, and it's a wrap.
Thanks so much for having me. Take
Bye
care.
all.
Thanks, y'all.